How's it going, everybody? Welcome back to the channel. Today we are back in Dark Souls 1 to do something that I have wanted to try out for a little bit, and that is to figure out exactly which element is best in Dark Souls 1. Of course, people have beaten the game miracles only, sorceries only, pyromancers only, etc., etc. So what I wanted to do was take the 4 different magic types: lightning, magic, fire, and dark. I'm excluding the magic miracles like Wrath of the Gods. And do 4 different runs using only that magic subtype and see which one of them is best in the early game, mid game, and then late game and overall. So, without further ado, let's hop into it. So how this is going to work is I'm going to go through the early game with each of the elements, rank them, the mid to mid-late game, do the same, and then the late game, which generally comprises the last Lord Soul, maybe the last 2 Lord Soul bosses, the DLC and Gwyn, and then rank them all at the very end. First up on our journey is Lightning. I just went with them as I figured it was going to be pretty easy in the early game. Obviously, the cleric class does not start with lightning spear, so technically if you do this in a legitimate game, you obviously couldn't beat the game lightning only. So what I did was I swapped out the spell for lightning spear. It's pretty reasonable. I mean, there's only 2 bosses, maybe even 1 boss if you take the master key that you need to beat in order to get lightning spear, but we're going to start off with it instead. Of course, this makes the Asylum Demon very easy. He was one of the quicker kills in all 4 of these runs. Similarly, the Taurus Demon is also fairly easy at this stage in the game, although getting through Undead Burg was a little bit of an issue just because we only have 10 casts. So for the most part, when I was doing a lot of early game boss runs, I had to skip all of the area enemies, which fortunately enough in Dark Souls 1 is not too difficult. But again, Taurus Demon, another really easy boss early game. With him down, we now have access to the Warriors of Sunlight Covenant, and because I've basically been pumping my faith up almost exclusively because I'm pretty worried about a fight towards the mid-game, we are able to join the Covenant and get a second copy of Lightning Spear. I did think about not doing this as to just have 1 copy, but doing some calculations for some fights later on in the game, I came to the conclusion that we do indeed need this second copy of Lightning Spear. Following that, it's time for the Bell Gargoyles. Now, I did summon Solaire for this fight because I wanted to cut down on sunlight metal farming later in the game, which kind of violates the rules of the run, but I don't really think it violates the spirit, so I figured it was okay to do. This fight was not very difficult, however, it does kind of highlight a key issue. Because we need so much faith in order to get our talisman magic adjust as high as possible for some later fights, we don't have any points to spare in dexterity, meaning our casting speed is exceptionally slow. This was of course one of the early fights, so I hadn't really gotten as used to it as I did towards the end of the run, but just be assured that it will become an issue in some fights later on. Off to the Moonlight Butterfly for some easy souls, and then it's down to the Hydra, so we can get 2 critical items in this run, in the Dust Crown Ring and the Dust Crown. These are going to be, of course, items that we're going to want in all 4 of our runs. This one wasn't too difficult, although the final head with Lightning Spear can be a little bit tricky. On our way back out of Dark Root Basin, we also make a quick stop to pick up the Red Tearstone Ring. And it's over to the Capra Demon to cap off a bit of an early game push. This was an annoying fight in itself because, again, the cast speed is pretty slow. Luckily, we have enough poise to take a couple hits from the dogs. Once we clear them out, the fight is not overly difficult. But as is the case with a lot of challenge runs, the Capra Demon can be a little bit of a slog. Continuing downwards into the depths, it's the Gaping Dragon next on our list, and I didn't mention this at the top, but I did not choose the Master Key for any of these runs, as I figured that would make things a little bit more interesting. Another boss that is fairly easy with ranged attacks as long as you're in light load. Again, the slow casting speed, I was really starting to get used to it at this point. I died a couple times here, but nothing too significant. The final task on our early game checklist is facing off against Chaos Witch Quelaag. Again, she is fairly easy with any type of ranged build, although it will be quite difficult in the fire-based run. But with lightning, it was not really much of a deal at all. After a fairly easy early game track with Lightning, it's back to the Northern Undead Asylum to kick off our next journey with the Magic User. This is of course a class that you can start with in any playthrough. We didn't make any changes to him this time, just your standard Soul Arrow and Sorcerer's Catalyst. Makes easy work of the Asylum Demon as well. No real upgrades yet, as we just make our way on through the normal gameplay progression route to take down the Taurus Demon. And for the first time in the suite of runs, we go down and free Griggs. We'll have to do this 2 more times in order to unlock him as a vendor, as well as to be able to purchase the Bellowing Dragon Crest ring. While we're here, of course, we can go ahead and take down the Capra Demon. I would say this fight is a little bit easier than the magic run just because the casting speed on some of the sorceries is a little bit better, and the tracking, especially for some of the Soul Arrow type spells, is a little bit better. So whenever Capra Demon's underneath you, you can really home down on it and put yourself out of harm's way. Before continuing down to Blighttown and into the mid-game, I wanted to stock up enough souls to be able to purchase the Bellowing Dragon Crest ring. So the Moonlight Butterfly was an easy target. Again, if you've ever done this fight with magic, it can take a little bit of time, but it's not that difficult, all things considered. And with a touch of farming here and there, we're able to save up that 20k for the ring. It's another stop down in Darkroot to pick up the Dusk Crown ring, as well as the Crown of Dusk after killing the Hydra. And with those 2 bits of powerful gear, despite the fact that we're still rocking relatively elementary spells, both the Gaping Dragon and Quelaag are easy targets as well to round out the early portions of the run for the magic user. It's only fitting that the last boss we faced off against was one immune to fire. Now let's start our fire-only journey. The start of this run is going to be a little bit dissimilar to other ones, although in hindsight I probably should have kept some of these black fire bombs instead of using them early to take down the Asylum Demon. But again, this isn't necessarily a pyromancy only run, it's fire damage only run, so those were an option, and I figured we might as well make use of at least one of the starting gifts for one of these kills here early. And the Taurus Demon, again, not a very difficult fight, all things considered, although this does highlight one of the issues, at least early game, with the Pyromancer, or the fire-only run, in that we only have 8 fireball casts right now, and getting an increase in either casts or upgrades to our Pyromancy Flame requires us to beat the Capra Demon. So I ultimately had to finish this fight using the 2-handed attack from the Pyromancy Flame. It does do 100% fire damage, though, so the run is still valid. After him, we go ahead and free Griggs for the second time on our journeys, and then we go ahead and face off against the Capra Demon, again knowing that we need to rush down Laurentius to improve our run. Somewhat interestingly is the fact that this Capra Demon was probably the toughest that I've had so far. Even more so than the Lightning run. That one was difficult because of the slow casting speed, but we were able to one-shot the dogs pretty easily. This one, we had to make the run down through the streets in order to get into the boss fight with full casts, and we also had to save a couple of black firebombs in order to actually take down the Capra Demon. That did include a couple of deaths here and there, so not too difficult, all things considered, but definitely tougher than both the Lightning and Magic runs up to this point. Now that we have access to the depths, we can finally unlock Laurentius, and he's obviously going to be the key component in this run. And before we go down to Blighttown, I had 2 key goals. 1, we wanted to purchase the Bellowing Dragon Crest ring, and 2, we wanted to get our Pyromancy Flame up to +10 in order to have access to Quelana the first time we go down there, as she sells some spells that we're going to need for the upcoming fights. Now, of course, there's one thing that I haven't done so far that I had been doing early in the other 2 runs, and that is face down the Bale Gargoyles. There wasn't really a reason that I decided to hold off until then, but now that we have a more upgraded Pyro Flame and Combustion, which is one of the best spells in the entire franchise, this was an easy fight. And again, in order to get enough souls to purchase the Bellowing Dragon Crest ring, it's the Moonlight Butterfly for yet another easy kill, and that allows us to get up to the 20k in order to buy the ring from Griggs. Another trip down to Darkroot to pick up the Dusk Crown ring and Crown of Dusk. Haven't really used the Dusk Crown ring in the previous 2 runs, but for this one, it is going to be a critical component in the fight against Quelaag, which I'll touch on once we get down there. Before that, though, another fight with a gaping dragon, another relatively easy one. This time that I did notice, I don't know if I've ever noticed this before, but sometimes when casting Fireball, the explosion would happen and then the damage would tick like half a second later. Just kind of a weird little quirk in this fight. Either way, a relatively easy fight once again. We're still a few thousand souls shy of getting our Pyromancy Flame up to a plus 10, which again was one of my really crucial goals here. So I decided to take a bit of a detour compared to my other 2 runs and went ahead and fought Pinwheel. The Rite of Kindling wasn't really a big deal here because we're not going to use it in the upcoming fight, but the extra souls were more than enough to top us off and get us up to a plus 10 before descending down. One last final task before our descent is to pick up the red Tearstone ring, and then we can finally make our way through Blighttown, making sure to pick up Power Within on our way down. Now that we're down at the bottom of Blighttown, we can talk to Quaylana. She's obviously going to be important to upgrade our Pyromancy Flame even further and ascend it to a plus 5 eventually, but the key role that she serves right now is the ability to sell us some additional spells that have a lot of casts, in particular Fireball and Great Combustion. And now we go down to the fight that I have been alluding to, and probably the one that you are wondering about. Of course, if you've played Dark Souls before, you know that Quelaag is entirely immune to fire damage. No matter what the source is, she will take 0 damage from any source of fire. Ultimately, there were 3 different options that I was split between. One was using Black Flame, although when doing some of the damage calculations, even with a maxed out Pyromancy Flame, this was going to take forever. The second was to go ahead and kill Mildred and let her do all the talking. But the third, and one that I ultimately decided upon, was actually removing the special effect from her that makes her immune to fire damage. Now, this does not make her an easy fight at all, because she still has 9,999 fire defense, which, if you know anything about the game or the defense calculations, doesn't technically mean anything, because no matter what the level of defense you have, you'll always take at least 10% of the total AR of the attack that you do. So by doing this, we do have to run both the red Tearstone ring and a bunch of other augmented buffs in order to have enough casts to be able to take her down. And let me tell you, this was no easy feat. Despite the fact that she can take damage from our pyromancies at this stage, she still took a long time to kill and many deaths. There was often times where I would get close to her and then I would ultimately be stuck between like 2 of her legs when she did her explosion attack. There's other times where I somehow ran onto the fire despite my body being a little bit further away than I think the hitbox should have registered. Either way, after enough time and effort, a couple of hours of attempts, we were able to take down Chaos Witch Quelaag and move on to our 4th and final contender, the man who wields the dark sorceries. Similar to the lightning user, the dark sorcery user also is going to start off with continuing on with some parallels from the lightning run. Up here in the Taurus Demon fight, you can kind of see that Dark Orb suffers the same kind of drawbacks as Lightning Spear, where the casting speed is relatively slow. Luckily, the better of the dark spells, that being Dark Bead, is a much quicker casting animation. Of course, we don't have that yet. Either way, another boss down. Next, I probably could have gone down to Darkroot and picked up some sorcery boosting gear, but I figured that we didn't need it for the gargoyles, and I was proven right as we're able to more than clear them, with the first one taking just 4 hits. As Dark Orb, it kind of falls off in power a little bit late game if you don't have the right equipment, but here early, the low flat defenses of the enemies make early fights pretty quick. And again, over to Moonlight Butterflies, I figured I'd get some early enemies down, as we need as many souls as we can possibly get, as we really have to pump up that intelligence stat in order to take down Artorias eventually. Continuing downwards, for the final time, we pick up the red Tearstone ring and the Crown of Dusk. And for the final time in our 4 runs, we free Griggs. Still nothing terrifically difficult, as once we're able to take down the dogs in the Capra Demon fight, it goes down as well. And for the final time, we can pick up the Bellowing Dragon Crest Ring. Our last time with the Gaping Dragon isn't, again, a terribly difficult fight, although, again, the slow casting speed did pose some troubles here and there. And while it didn't happen in this fight, I only finished with 3 available casts left, which is going to become a crucial element of the early game portions of this run until we can get that second copy of Dark Orb. And the final boss of our runs in the early game goes to Chaos Witch Quelaag once again, who after the long fight that we had using fire only, this was a nice respite using Dark Orb. We're able to space her out pretty easily and do this first try. So with our final Bell of Awakening run, let's talk about my thoughts on the early game difficulty using all 4 elements. Ultimately, I wouldn't say that any of the 4 runs were overly difficult, with the one exception being the Quelaag fight with the fire damage only, which again, of course, you can't do in a regular game, and just due to the nature of how things work, this fight just took a really, really long time. For that reason, and that reason alone, I would definitely put it as the most difficult of the 4. The other 3, again, there's really little separating them. I would say that the Lightning run was a touch easier, mainly because Lightning Spear is a very strong spell, and we were able to get a second copy of it. And I'm just putting Magic a little bit above Dark, because with Dark, there's only one option. And while it's not the most difficult, it's kind of tough to actually go through and clear some areas while running up to the boss and saving your casts. So you've got to sprint through the areas. Not a tremendously difficult thing to do here in Dark Souls 1, but it is a little bit of added difficulty compared to Magic. So all that, let's head up to Sen's Fortress with all 4 of our runs and see how the mid-game fares. Starting off with the mid-game, we're going to go in a bit of a different order. We'll pick back up with the Magic User. In Sen's Fortress, our first goal is to unlock Logan as a vendor, so it's down to the bottom to get the cage key, and then it's back to free Logan, who we can send back to Firelink Shrine, and with all the souls that we have in our pocket, we can go and purchase some stronger firepower, not the least of which is going to be Soul Spear. It's time to take down the Iron Golem for the first time with some increased power levels. And if you've ever fought him with range, you'll know that this is a pretty short fight. No reason to slow down our momentum, so it's straight on to the ONS fight. Had a couple of issues with them a few times just because we're relatively squishy, because I've really been bumping up my intelligence stat and not much into health or stamina. However, with the amount of damage we can output in our casts, and the fact that we can get into phase 2 relatively quickly by taking down Ornstein, the ONS fight is a relatively simple one this go around. With the Lord Vessel Place, there is a lot of stuff opened up to us, but if you are a Magic user, of course the optimum place to head on to is going to be the Duke's Archives. Here we can go ahead and free Logan and move him to his new vendor position outside of the Crystal Caves. Because, of course, we're going to want the Tin Crystallization Catalyst, and to a lesser extent, White Dragon Breath. I figured it was high time we stopped off back at the Asylum once more to take down the Stray Demon, netting us a cool 20,000 souls. And with all those souls in hand, we can clear out Logan's inventory, setting us up for the eventuality of getting both that Catalyst and White Dragon Breath, as I mentioned. Now, in hindsight, I probably could have just done the Seath fight right away and gotten a nice power increase for some situations, but for whatever reason, I decided against doing that, and I went down into the Demon Ruins first. Ceaseless Discharge, of course, is a relatively easy fight if you fight him with magic. And the Demon Fire Sage is also a touch more difficult than his predecessors, but still a relatively easy fight, all things considered. And among the 3 demons, the Centipede Demon being the last, I think is actually the easiest if you're fighting him with a ranged magic build. The Bed of Chaos is, of course, the Bed of Chaos. The only thing easier is going to be our next boss, which is Pinwheel, who was a 2-shot. In hindsight, I kind of wish I one-shot him, but that's alright. I've done enough one-shot stuff before. And then it's Nito time, who luckily we can one-shot the skeletons in the room with a standard soul arrow. And then we do typical Nito things where he just walks slowly towards us while we pelt him with spells, taking him down in a few seconds. Only a few tasks left in our mid-game stretch for the magic user. First of which is taking down Sif. And the final boss of the mid-game route for this guy is going to be Seath the Scaleless, who again I kind of put off towards the back end of this mid-game route. I always expect it to be a little bit more difficult when you're doing a magic user, but I sometimes forget just how busted sorcery builds can be in Dark Souls 1. Before hopping back over to a different run, however, the last thing we're going to do is pick up Logan's Catalyst and then kill Logan for the Tin Crystallization Catalyst and White Dragon Breath. And that'll conclude the mid-game for the magic user. Continuing in our kind of weird machete order that we got going on here, we jump back over to the dark user, and it's time for the Iron Golem right away. This time I did not go back to the bonfire to reset my casts, so I was using the Dusk Crown Ring as well as all my other relevant buffs, and I only came in with 10 casts. Again, the Iron Golem has never been a very difficult boss whenever you fight him at range, so we were able to do this pretty much no problem. After him, of course, it is back to ONS for the second time in this video, and this was one of the more difficult fights in this playthrough, or in all 4 of the playthroughs, really. The reason being is that there are 2 options that we have here. The first is going through with the Dusk Crown Ring and getting those extra casts, but that leaves us in the position where we could only miss, I think it was 1 or 2 Dark Orb casts. I don't remember exactly how many it was, but there was very, very little room for error. But it's not like what we ended up doing had much less room for error either, because in order to win this fight, we need to be in Red Tearstone Ring range. This makes Ornstein relatively easy, and Smo not super difficult as well, but again, the problem of the slow casting speed, as well as the inability to miss more than a couple times, makes this one a very, we'll call it particular, maybe even precise type of fight, where we have to kite them around, make sure we get good openings, and then phase 2, we got to make sure we don't hit Smo's hammer whenever he's doing his charge attack too often, lest we find ourselves in a situation where we can't beat them. Luckily, I had a lot of experience from an upcoming fight against these guys in a different one of my runs that you'll see in just a few moments, but we were able to get them down in relatively short order, as again, that practice was really paying off here. At this stage in the run, I was trying to put off the DLC for as much as I possibly could because I was fearful of the Artorias fight. I was fairly confident that I could take down the demon path all the way through the Bed of Chaos, as the Demon Fire Sage is not that tricky, and I thought that I could do him. I did have to resort to using the Dusk Crown Ring, so you're seeing that pop up. It's either that or the Red Tearstone Ring for a number of these fights, and here's where I really started to feel the burn of just having the 12 casts by default. Luckily for the Centipede Demon, we were able to just go back to our default setup, so we were not in range of getting one shot on every attack. Again, I mentioned it in the magic run, but this is a fight that I find incredibly easy whenever you're using a magic-based build. So he goes down for the second time. Once more, it's a quick Bed of Chaos kill, and then back to the Duke's Archive so we can pick up the Broken Pendant, getting set for the DLC. And the final boss of the quote-unquote mid-game for the Dark user was going to be Sif. I think I might have been able to possibly get Nito. I don't think that Seath or the Four Kings would be doable at this stage with our limited number of casts we had. There's certainly a couple more bosses that I haven't gotten yet, but I decided to leave them for the late game portion of this specific run because I felt it was a little bit more thematically appropriate, as after we enter the DLC, that's going to be kind of our cutoff for the end game portions of these runs. Outside of that, though, Sif was relatively easy. Again, I think I've talked about it a little bit, but magic does make a lot of these bosses fairly easily, and then once you can get under Sif, you can cast up into her body and take her down with pretty much no trouble at all. Alright, so let's pick back up with the lightning fella, and our first step before we jump into the mid-game is to pick up a new talisman. This is going to be done by killing all the paladins in Firelink Shrine and getting the ivory one, which is going to be our main talisman for the most part. I could have probably farmed for the Dark Moon talisman, but that's not something I felt like doing in this particular run. Back up through Sens. Again, it's another range fight with the Iron Golem. Slow casting speed made it a little bit tedious, but still easy. One final stop before we start throwing ourselves at a fight most dreadful. Let's pick up the Ring of the Sun's Firstborn in the Dark Moon Tomb. And now it's on to the dynamic duo, and let me tell you that this fight was probably the toughest, maybe second or third toughest fight in all 4 of these runs, and one of the more difficult fights I have done in quite some time across any Dark Souls game. Now, Phase 1 itself is not the most difficult, and realistically, if you could kill Ornstein first and take down Smo second in Phase 2, that would be quite a bit easier, but the combination of Ornstein's mobility, his tendency to dodge, and the really, really slow casting time of Lightning Spear makes killing him first a tremendous difficulty. The obvious problem is that we have to do 2 things. 1, we have to be in red Tearstone Ring range, and 2, we have to make sure that we make almost all of our hits land. So, the Phase 2 fight against Ornstein, his lightning defense jumps up to, it's like 1400 or something crazy like that. Same situation as the Quelaag fight when we were fighting her with fire, where basically we're getting 10 to 20% of the damage that we would get against other enemies. And that makes every single hit need to count. Now, we can get him stuck on some pillars in Phase 2, but if he breaks out of that, it makes things very difficult. And again, making every single hit count is absolutely imperative, as if you miss a couple of them, we come into the situation where there's not enough damage left to kill Ornstein in Phase 2, which happened to me more than once. Now, realistically, I think it's unfair to say that the only way to actually do this fight is to get Ornstein in a loop where he continuously fires his lightning beam into one of the columns, and we make use of the fact that we fire from our right hand and we have a little bit of space off to the right where we can snipe him from afar. But I gotta tell you, it's a little bit difficult to convey just how long this fight took me. I want to say I have 3 or 4 hours of me trying this fight over and over and over again, because not only is the first phase a little bit tedious because you have to wait for a situation where you can get a clean cast off in a spot where Ornstein won't dodge, and get in front of the lightning bolt so that you can actually hit Smo, but getting him in an AI loop in Phase 2 proved to be quite difficult as well. Luckily, eventually the winning run, that's what we were able to do, and we just stuck behind that pillar, firing lightning spear after lightning spear after lightning spear, and ultimately took down ONS. Again, this is easily one of the top 3 most difficult fights I did in all 4 of these runs. We'll have some contenders later towards the back half of these runs as well. In a bit of a different route as well, we are going to go back to Sen's Fortress to grab ourselves the Gold Covetous Serpent Ring for 2 reasons. The first is to farm enough humanity to get to rank 2 in the Daughters of Chaos Covenant, which will allow us to bypass some bosses, but more importantly, it unlocks the Sunlight Metal Farm here in a little bit. Before we get down there, it's another Ceaseless Discharge fight. And while not strictly necessary for this run, as again we have that shortcut unlocked, I did go ahead and defeat the Demon Fire Sage in order to unlock the quicker shortcut back to Quelaag's Bonfire. Using the aforementioned Serpent Ring, let's go farm for some Sunlight Metals, and while we're down here we can go ahead and take care of the Bed of Chaos. With it down, it's back up to the surface level to go back to the Altar of Sunlight, pick ourselves up a nice power boost and Great Lightning Spear, and then back down into the Catacombs where we can make Pinwheel a joke for the umpteenth time. A couple more bosses before we approach the end game, the first of which is going to be Nito. Again, this one is a little tricky as well, mainly owing to the slow casting speed and the skeletons, which can rush you down. But as long as we stack enough poise, it's not as big of a deal, although this fight can be a little bit annoying. Sif, however, the last boss of this section, is not as big of a deal, as she leaves pretty big openings, bigger than I actually remember, but as long as you're underneath her and she does one of her spin attacks, you're able to get a cast in with basically 100% regularity. So an easy boss fight to round out the mid-game for lightning. There's just one more. Let's head back over to the fire user. Rounding out the mid-game with our fire character, it is immediately up to the Iron Golem, who was another easy fight here. In fact, this was the only time in all 4 of my runs that I got to have him do the special falling animation. And with nothing much more to do in Anorlando, it's straight on to ONS once more. Now, I did do this fight after the lightning fight, so I was pretty well primed to handle everything that they could throw at me. But if you've ever done a Soul Level 1 run with Pyromancies, or just a Pyromancy only run, you'll know that this fight is definitely one of the easier ones, especially if you know what you're doing and how to get your flame as upgraded as I had it during this fight. So easy, in fact, I got them on my first try, which was a nice change of pace. Amusingly enough, for yet another one of our runs, our next path is going to be down into the Demon Ruins, where we face off against the Demon Fire Sage. We're doing this, of course, to continue progress on Quelana's quest, because we want to get Firestorm and all the other powerful spells that she can provide. Now that we're down here and we have placed the Lord Vessel, we can go back to Quelana and receive her request to kill the Bed of Chaos, which, of course, that is going to be our next step, as we have unlocked rank 2 in the Covenant to pick up Chaos Storm, and just because it's thematically appropriate for this type of run, come back to her and she grants us one of the best pyromancies in the game. We continue our journey down into the depths and below Tomb of the Giants time and Gravelord Nito once again. Again, if you just have enough poise and you're able to take down the skeletons in one cast like we are able to with Combustion, we can take down Gravelord Nito rather easily, especially because some of the pillar type spells can hit him multiple times during each cast. One last task here in the mid-game for all 4 runs, and that is taking down Great Grey Wolf Sif once more. Again, Fire Tempest makes this a rather easy fight as well. So with all 4 runs now done with the middle stage of the game, or at least the section of the game that I'm loosely defining as the middle part of the game, let's go back to our board here and talk about which one was easiest, which one was hardest, and what falls in between. By far, the most difficult fight that I've had up to this point, even harder than the Chaos Witch Quelaag fight, was the Ornstein and Smo fight with lightning only. That certainly tops the list, and again, I mentioned it in that fight itself, but I must have spent, 2, 3, 4 hours perhaps, dying over and over and over again, because you just kind of got to be perfect unless you get really, really good RNG in the second phase, and even then, it doesn't always mean that you're going to win. Easiest, it's definitely a toss-up between fire and magic. I think magic is a little bit easier, especially because once you place down the Lord Vessel and know what you're doing, there is not a lot of trouble getting some really powerful spells from Logan and kind of dog walking a lot of the different fights in the game. But Pyromancy is obviously very strong as well. As for Dark, I think that comfortably slots in as the 3rd most difficult. It's not super hard in comparison to either the magic or fire, but there are certainly some fights where you have to make use of some resources, like the Dust Crown Ring and the Red Tearstone Ring, in order to win. Again, owing mostly to the fact that there are a limited number of casts available to you if you're doing this type of run. Anyway, let's hop back in and finish this one out, and then let's figure out which one do I think is the toughest element-only run in the entire game. This time we're going to pick back up with the Dark user, and this is going to be quite a bit different than all of the other runs, as we immediately need to hop into the DLC. As I've mentioned, that we need to get some more casts of both Dark Orb and then eventually Dark Bead. The tough barrier to entry, of course, is going to be the Sanctuary Guardian, and here is where the slow cast speed really takes its toll on us in this fight. Throughout my attempts, I found that there was really only a couple of punishable moves, given the length of casting that we're stuck to right now. The most consistent one was definitely when he does his attack where he flies up in the air, does a swoop down, but does not shoot the lightning. And that gives us a real opportunity to hit him. Other than that, this one took quite a number of tries, and again, we are kind of forced into the situation where we need to either use the Dust Crown Ring or the Red Tearstone Ring. Ultimately, I decided that it was more sensible to use the Red Tearstone Ring, as we're basically in one-shot territory anyway if we have half health, given the stat investment on this run. So while this did not take me as many tries as either the Quelaag fight with the Fire User, it did take me less tries as well than compared to the Ornstein and Smo fight. It was still quite a difficult fight indeed, and I would probably say it was maybe the 6th or 5th toughest fight throughout all 4 of these playthroughs. From one very difficult fight to another, it is straight on to Artorias with basically the exact same setup, using Red Tearstone Ring, and of course we're going to get one shot by any attack that he throws at us, so this basically has to be a perfect fight. Similar to the Sanctuary Guardian, Artorias is of course one of, if not the quickest boss in the entire game, and the slow casting speed of Dark Orb is really a huge problem in this fight. Ultimately, there are only a couple of safe opportunities to actually get a cast in. One is if you can bait the overhead jump slam attack, and even then that one's sometimes inconsistent if you're a little too far away, as he likes to dodge. Another one is when he goes for his running stab attack. If you can dodge and get your cast off really quick after he goes by you, then that's an opportunity to actually get a cast in and do some damage. And then if you can catch him on his buffing animation, if you can get 2 hits in, the third one will stagger him if you're quick enough, but you got to be careful that you don't cast too many times when he's in that buff stage, as that only does about half damage, so if you were to hit too many of those, you wouldn't have enough cast to actually finish the fight. Ultimately, this was the toughest fight in the Dark User run by quite a bit, even more difficult than the Sanctuary Guardian fight, whereas that fight I think took me around 40 minutes of attempts. I think the Artorias fight took me about 2.5 hours, and that was me dying over and over and over because, again, he is just so quick. Ultimately, once we're able to get him down, this does open us up to getting some additional sorceries, which is going to be really nice and a huge power spike for the rest of this run. Now, with Artorias out of the way, we can finally pick up that second copy of Dark Orb, as I have been alluding to, and we can make our way into the Chasm of Abyss to pick up Dark Bead. And let's head back to the base game to finish off some bosses there before tackling the rest of the DLC and Gwyn. First up is going to be Seath, and I decided that let's go full-on hyper mode strats here with Dark Bead and the Red Tearstone Ring, because Seath is a relatively easy boss if you can get a few casts in, which, given the cast speed of Dark Bead, which if you compare it to some of the previous fights, you can see is like, I don't know, twice, maybe even 3 times as fast, this fight turns into a bit of a joke. Moving on to find our next Lord Soul Holder, let's go down into the Catacombs, and we get our first one-shot of the run in Pinwheel, who goes down to a single cast of Dark Bead. And it's over to Nito, who is marginally more difficult, but as some of the previous fights have shown, as long as we can one-shot the skeletons, in this case we can with Dark Orb, while stacking enough poise, we can wait till Nito makes his way over and then just Dark Beat him to death as well. Before tackling the remaining few bosses, I figured let's go and get ourselves another power spike and pick up the Manus Catalyst, as I haven't really been showing my stats, but I had been leveling strength as part of this run as well to make sure that our dark sorceries were doing as much damage as they possibly could. This was also the last of the 4 runs I did in sequence, so I was feeling really confident against Manus, and I even went in there with the Red Tearstone Ring active. This fight did take me 3 tries because when he does that one attack where he rains down the dark orbs from the top of the sky, I find that one to be a little bit tricky to dodge if your spacing isn't correct. Like if you're a little bit too close, sometimes I find getting out of the way horizontally can be a little bit tricky. Other than that, though, I was feeling really, really good, as I have really learned Manus' moveset quite excellently at this point in my Dark Souls challenge run career, I guess is what you would say. Ultimately, we only actually needed all 6 casts of Dark Bead, and we didn't have to use a single Dark Orb in this fight. But with him down, we can pick up his soul, go ahead and transpose it into the Manus Catalyst, and then take down the rest of the bosses in the game. Finishing up the DLC, it's over to Calamite, and again, as this was the last of the 4 runs that I did, I was feeling very confident in his moveset, so I decided it was just time to go back to the Red Tearstone Ring 3 dark beads and a dark orb to his midsection is all it takes for the final boss of the DLC to go down. Now there's just 2 left. One of the reasons I held off on the 4 kings for so long was I was afraid that I was not going to have enough casts, but that really ended up not being the case, as using all of our dark bead casts, all 6 of them, without using the Manus Catalyst was enough to 2-shot 2 of the 4 kings, and then we were able to get 1 more hit in on the death animation, so the final king only took 3 hits. I did, however, almost choke at the end as I got grabbed twice, but luckily with full health it was not quite enough to kill me, and as long as we were able to dodge 1 attack and get that final cast in, the 4 kings go down on our first try. Again, almost choked it, but luckily I was able to pull it out in the end. And then the final boss of the Dark User run is a anticlimactic finish. And of course, as it always is with Gwyn, parry, dark bead, and the final boss goes down for the first time. With Gwyn dead on the Dark run, let's head back over to the Magic run and start off with the 4 kings who we just killed a moment ago. This fight is very similar, as the power level is pretty comparable, although I think the fact that we have access to homing Crystal Soul Mass, as well as 2 really strong spells in Crystal Soul Spear and regular Soul Spear, and we don't have our casts halved, made this a little bit easier, but they were mainly on the same level of difficulty. Again, I just found this one a little bit easier, probably because I didn't get grabbed. Either way, the 4 kings are really easy if you build properly, as you can see in this fight and the last one. After that, it's immediately back into the DLC, where it's once again time to take on the Sanctuary Guardian. This fight went a whole lot smoother, despite the fact that I missed a Crystal Soul Spear and switched to Soul Arrow instead of regular Soul Spear at the tail end of the fight, which could have made things go a little bit faster. Almost choked it out at the end, but luckily I was able to get him on the first try. Continuing on through the DLC, it is once again time for Arctorius, and this fight sits in pretty stark contrast, I would say, to the Dark fight, where the Soul Spear type spells are able to really chunk down like the first 80-85% of his HP, and for some reason I was stubbornly insistent on using the Soul Mass type spells to get the last of his HP down, even though I think a couple of Soul Arrows would suffice. Either way, despite the fact that I was stubborn in that, it is another first try victory here in the DLC for the Magic User. Again, only a few more bosses. Let's head down to the Chasm of the Abyss to face off against Manus. And this one was a little bit frustrating, I gotta tell you, as I choked when he had less than 5% HP twice, as I didn't have enough casts of Soul Spear and Crystal Soul Spear combined to take down all of his HP, so I was trying to use Soul Arrow, as its casting speed is quite a bit quicker than either Great Soul Arrow, Heavy Soul Arrow, or Great Heavy Soul Arrow. Ultimately, I decided to go to Dusk Crown Ring setup, and I almost choked a 3rd time. Luckily, with half HP, I was able to survive 1 hit, heal, and then finally get Manus to go down. But a bit of a close call at the end there, and I was a little bit frustrated that I couldn't get him on either of my first 2 tries. Because again, getting him down to like less than 5% HP, I thought for sure I had it in the bag, and then you end up taking a stray hit, and it's all for naught. On to Calamite for the 2nd time in this video, and I gotta say, I don't know if I mentioned it, but he is probably the DLC boss that I feel the most comfortable fighting against, especially with a ranged build, as there are so many opportunities to dodge away and then get a good solid cast off, especially if you have the longer range spells like Soul Spear and Crystal Soul Spear. I was trying to be cinematic towards the middle of the fight and use White Dragon Breath, as of course I'm fighting a dragon, so let's figure, let's go ahead and use that against him. I shied away from that after missing him a couple of times and just went back to the Soul Mass type spells and ultimately took him down on one of my first tries as well. Don't remember if it was my 2nd try or 3rd try, but I know I only died to him a couple of times at most. And our last fight, once again, is going to be against Gwyn with the Magic User. Yes, I did die 1 time because I missed a parry, but once we finally get into the proper setup, we hit that parry, Crystal Soul Spear, once again for a rather underwhelming final boss of the Magic run. We're going to have another easy one, but I promise you the last fight in this run was not so smooth. Anyways, it's back over to the Fire User. Picking back up, we again start off in the Abyss, facing down the 4 kings, and I'll say that this fight was also pretty easy. But the killing power of Pyromancy, while very, very strong, was not quite as much as either the Dark or Sorcery user. Still, it only takes 3 kings to fully cycle their HP down, so I would say another easy fight, and this one was also a first-time victory. I realized at this point I had yet to do Seath, so it's back to the Duke's Archives in Crystal Cave to go face off against the dragon himself. This one we finally got to use one of our shiny new tools and Fire Tempest. One of those and a couple of Great Combustions has Seath go down very quickly. So quickly he only got one attack off, in fact. I think this was probably the easiest Seath kill out of all 4 of the runs. It was just really, really fast. And back to the DLC for the 3rd time. Of course, Sanctuary Guardian is our first foe. Tried using Fire Tempest for some big damage, but the casting time was just a little bit too slow. I kept getting interrupted. So it was tried and true going back to Great Combustion. And as soon as I started doing that, the fight went down really, really quickly, as this was a first try victory. Back to Artorias for the penultimate time, and I don't know why I was being stubborn with trying to get the Fire Tempest hits to land, but once I stopped doing that, this fight became much easier, and again, just going back to the tried and true Great Chaos Fireball and Great Combustion was more than enough to take him down, and this was another fight where luckily we don't have to be in a hyper mode range, or we don't have to use the Dust Crown Ring, so even though I did take a couple of stray hits here and there, the health and defense that I had were more than enough to let me live even a couple of hits back to back. And we get yet another first try victory here in the Fire User Run. And back down to Manus for the penultimate time as well. I think this probably was the easiest out of all of the Manus fights across the 4 runs, as Pyromancy has access to a lot of really hard hitters, and the casting speed is pretty quick. There are some spells that are a little bit quicker, but there really isn't anything that takes too long to cast in terms of Pyromancy outside of the pillar type spells. So taking down Manus was relatively easy, and I did this on my second go around, which was the fewest deaths I had against him in any of the 3 runs. And it's kind of a similar story with Calamite, as we have access to a number of good Pyromancies. We have ranged options, close range options, and one thing I guess I haven't really gone into, but we have a lot more health and endurance in this run, because of course, we just need to level up our Pyromancy Flame and some attunement. Outside of that, we can level up health and endurance as much as we want. So there are very, very few wasted levels, as we're not trying to hit any soft caps or anything. We're just leveling things up as we go. So the defensive prowess we had in this run was quite a bit higher than some of the other ones that I had to do. Either way, Calamite, again, a boss that I'm relatively comfortable with. It did take a little bit longer, as I ended up running out of some of my harder hitting spells, because it does have pretty good defense, and while Pyromancies are very strong, they're not quite as strong comparably to stuff like Crystal Soul Spear or Dark Bead, unless again you're using those pillar type spells, which I didn't really feel like doing here in Calamite. So despite the fact that this was one of the longer, I think it might have been the longest or second longest fight against Calamite I had across all of the fights, I think it was probably the safest, or at least up there in terms of safety. And for our penultimate fight with Gwyn, it is yet another easy one, although just a touch more difficult, I would say, than either the magic or dark users, as Great Combustion can't get him down in 2 casts. However, you can get the parry, get 2 Great Combustion casts off, and then you can either get him in a stun lock, or he might try to dodge away, which make things a lot easier. Did have to get 2 parries here, but a relatively easy fight against Gwyn as well. And it's time to head back to where it all began and finish off our lightning run. We'll slot right back in at the Seath fight with our lightning user, who I totally forgot to do in the mid-game portion when I was doing these recordings. I think that just goes to show that Seath is somewhat of a forgettable boss. I like his arena, I like the Duke's Archives quite a bit, but him as a boss fight might be I don't know if it's the easiest boss fight, but it's certainly up there in terms of being easy. Don't look at the fact that I actually died in here once. That was when one of the clams got in and I got caught on him. Ended up dying because, again, the casting speed is pretty slow. Either way, despite the fact that he's got a lightning weakness, I'm pretty sure we're doing the least amount of damage with our Great Lightning Spear, which is mostly just funny. Either way, again, a really easy boss, especially when you can stay this far away and just cast our Lightning Spears with basically impunity. And then right back down to the Abyss for the last of the Lord Soul bosses and the 4 Kings. This time I kind of went with a different strat that I have showcased in any of my other fights so far, and that was using Power Within along with the Sanctus, although that didn't really offset it too much, as I had decently high health at this point. Ultimately, though, just throwing on Havel's armor and tanking a couple of hits, using our Great Lightning Spears with great effect is more than enough to get them down on our first go-around as well. And for the final time, we head into the DLC once more, and we are immediately faced with yet another super difficult fight. As alongside Ornstein and Gwyn, Sanctuary Guardian has, I think, the third highest lightning defense in the entire game. It might actually be higher than Ornstein, I can't remember off the top of my head. Either way, the speed of his attacks, the ability for him to move around and dodge projectiles at random intervals, and the fact that we are still rocking a very, very slow cast speed makes this fight incredibly difficult, especially considering that we're barely doing over one of the 12 pips of his health bar per cast of Great Lightning Spear. So we have to dodge around, and this fight took me forever. In fact, if I look at it, we go for around 4.5 minutes in this fight in total, which is quite a bit of a lengthy boss fight when it comes to Dark Souls 1. Ultimately, however, with our good health and the fact that we can have some decent armor, we're able to get out of here, but not before taking a few deaths. Again, I didn't track individual fights, but this one definitely took me more than 5, maybe even closer to 10 total tries, and it was a slog. Unfortunately, however, we were able to get him down in the end without having to resort to any strats involving the Red Tearstone Ring or the Dust Crown Ring, but yeah, very difficult fight, all things considered, although slightly easier, I would say, than the Ornstein and Smo fight. This would be probably the fifth or sixth most difficult fight I had to do across all 4 of these runs. And for the final time in the video, we go ahead and face down Artorias once again. Same issues as we've had with a few of these fights where the cast speed is a lot longer than we'd like it to be in order to get some good hits in on him. Luckily, however, the bullet itself, the lightning spear, whenever you throw it, is pretty quick, and I don't actually know if Artorias can actually dodge that one as he can with some of the soul arrow type spells. I don't think I ever saw it happen, but it was a nice little boon for us, even though the fight itself was rather difficult. Fortunately, we didn't again have to resort to any tactics like using RTSR or the Dust Crown Ring, as having the 10 Great Lightning Spears and then the 20 regular Lightning Spears in backup were more than enough to chunk him down and get our final victory over Artorias in this video. Once more down into the Chasm of the Abyss to face off against Manus. And if I've mentioned it once, I've mentioned it 100 times, but the issues again with the lightning cast speed are very prevalent in this fight once again. And even more so here, we face ourselves with not doing excellent damage. It's not terrible, I would say, but the fact that we have to use all 10 of our Great Lightning Spears and dip into the Lightning Spears themselves is a little bit worrying for the Gwyn fight coming up. And again, this is another fight that took me quite a long time. This one was a little bit over 4 minutes, which again, if you've not played this in a while, doesn't seem like that long, but man, when you're facing off against Manus for that long, you know, a couple of mistakes ends you, and it really gets a little bit annoying whenever you die. Ultimately, I was able to kindle the fire back in the dungeon area, have all 20 of my Estus flasks, and take him down with enough patience, but another rather difficult fight. It didn't take me too many tries, all things considered, but just the length of each try really started to add up here. And again, back to Calamity, and it's more of the same once again, as this was yet another fight that clocked in at over 4 minutes. Got to play it really, really safe, you know, making sure we get our hits in when they count, because we don't want to lose any of the Great Lightning Spear hits, as the Lightning Spears are good, but with the elemental defenses of bosses in the DLC cranked up to like over 700, 800, 900 sometimes, and not having as much power behind all of our casts, even though it still is good, this makes this yet another long, drawn-out fight. Again, ultimately, I've mentioned this in a couple of the previous fights, but Calamite I'm pretty comfortable with, so even though this one did actually take me a couple of tries because I died because I was getting a little bit too aggressive on some of my attempts, I was able to take him down in relatively short order. If I remember correctly, I think this one only took me 3 or maybe 4 tries, but that's still a bit higher, I think, than all 3 of the other fights I had combined. And now we come to the very last fight of the video. Once more, it is time for Gwyn, Lord of Cinder, lightning only. And if I have talked about how difficult some of the previous fights were, specifically against Ornstein and Smo and the Sanctuary Guardian with their high lightning defense, Well, Gwyn takes that and turns it up to 11. He doesn't necessarily have much higher defenses than those two bosses, but he's got a lot more HP, and he is uber aggressive if you are not using melee attacks, or if you can't get him down in a couple of parries and spell casts like we have seen with some of the other runs previously. I want to say that the final winning fight in this run took me well over 10 minutes of in-game time, and that's with me rocking full Havel's armor, outside of the headpiece of course, to get that extra magic damage from the Crown of Dusk, and using a good chunk of both our Estus flasks and a lot of humanities to constantly regain HP. The real difficulty in this fight is the fact that when you parry, your cast will come out after Gwyn has gone into his re-aggressive mode, so his stun lock doesn't continue through the full length of your cast. So you're generally able to hit him. In fact, I think I was able to hit him with just about every single cast in this fight, but the fact that he regains his fighting ability when you're mid-cast means that you'll often take a hit yourself. So even though I tried doing this without full Havels and using some lighter armor, light rolling rather, it just wasn't possible, and we had to go full-on tank build. Out of all the fights, I would definitely say that this one was the least enjoyable, and I do think it was the most difficult out of all the fights. In terms of time, I don't think it took me quite as long as the Ornstein and Smo fight, but that one's difficult for different reasons. In terms of a one-on-one matchup and maintaining your mental composure for the length of the fight, the Gwyn fight against Lightning Only was by far the most difficult fight in this run, and I think is a fitting cap to end us here. So with all 4 runs out of the way, let's talk about what was the most difficult late game and then overall. Somewhat ironically, I suppose, I would definitely think that the middle and late game were roughly on par in terms of difficulty, with Magic being the easiest, Fire being the second easiest, Dark in third, and then Lightning being the most difficult. It's a pretty interesting contrast from Lightning, where I think it was by far the easiest and most powerful in the early game, and that's owing to the fact that there are not many lightning-resistant enemies until you reach Anorlando, and the fact that Lightning Spear is a very, very good spell, although it does kind of fall off towards the tail end of the game, especially when you can get some of the uber-powerful spells in the other Magic classes. Overall, I think they would also match up that way. I do think that Magic was the easiest. I tracked deaths and the time to beat in all 4 of the runs, and Magic had by far the least amount of deaths with 32. Coming in second was Fire with 41, Dark was 74, and then Lightning had a whopping 151 deaths, which was just about the same amount as the other 3 runs combined in a interesting twist. Now, as far as playtime goes, again, the Dark user was just a little bit quicker than the Magic user, although a lot of the Magic user playtime was artificially inflated by the fact that we had to keep going back and forth between vendors and whatnot in order to unlock some of the very, very powerful stuff. Whereas the Dark user has a really good spell to start off with, but the key component into making that run difficult is the fact that you only have that one cast for a good chunk of the game, and you can't get a second copy and, of course, Dark Bead until after you defeat Artorias, which is quite difficult as you need to make the most out of your casts in that particular fight. Overall, of course, the Lightning run, it's got to be the most difficult by far. Owing to the fact that the Ornstein and Smo fight, the Gwyn fight, and to somewhat of a lesser extent, the Sanctuary Guardian fight were super, super difficult. I would definitely put the Ornstein and Smo fight and the Gwyn fight, Lightning only, as the 2 most difficult runs, or 2 most difficult fights in this run. I think the Artorias fight was probably a little bit more difficult than the Sanctuary Guardian fight in terms of Dark versus Lightning. And really the only difficult fight in terms of like drawn out fight lengths and what have you between the Magic and Fire runs was the Fire only run against Quelaag, which again, it's not actually even possible in the actual game. So if you're looking at this from a pragmatic standpoint, I suppose you would say that's the most difficult, because doing fire damage only is technically impossible if you're doing this type of run here in Dark Souls 1. Ultimately, though, they were all a bit fun outside of some of the stages for lightning. If you're looking for an interesting challenge, I think dark only is probably the most interesting out of these. Of course, you can do magic and fire only, again, with the exception of Quelaag and a couple other bosses that I guess I didn't really touch on, but I did the same changes to those, like the Bed of Chaos and Ceaseless Discharge. But yeah, if you have a PC and you know how to do this with Dark Orb only, I think that's a good challenge run. The others are, your mileage may vary. Sorcery only was easy, and lightning only, again, was very difficult for those 3 fights specifically. Outside of that, I think it was definitely up there in terms of strength. Well, that was a good one. I enjoyed doing all 4 of those runs. I enjoyed making this video. Definitely a different type of content that I'm used to producing here. So if you enjoyed it, feel free to leave a like, a comment, or a subscription. If you try any of these out, I'd be love to hear your thoughts on them as well. See if your rankings line up with mine, or if you find it to be difficult, or find the difficulty to be different than what I ended up thinking about after I completed all 4 of those. Until then, thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.